Hi, this is Arnie Arneson, and this is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arneson and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. What do we call this day? Because we actually tape on Wednesday, but every single fourth Thursday of the month, since January of, I think it was 2021, we have been offering something called Race Class. We've been doing it for 3 years, you guys. It's just unbelievable to me. But let me remind you, in case this is the first time you've ever tuned in to a race class, that we began this way. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, BU Law Professor Jonathan Feingold and The Attitude with Arnie Arneson are offering Race Class, a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history, rather than fear and anxiety. In describing the foundational purpose of Race Class, Feingold noted, "We know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means." I am so grateful that when I pitched the idea to you way back when, Jonathan, you said, "Sure, Arnie, I'll join you once a month." And I think we thought initially that once a month would last maybe a couple of months, and now we're going into the end of our third year. But in some ways, this class is needed now more than ever. It's needed now more than ever because you know they're going to be playing the race card against Kamala Harris. You know that what they're doing now with white Christian nationalism is playing the race card. We now know under Project 2025 what is happening here. You know, the idea that you can't teach about diversity, equity, or inclusion, you can't even include it in any of the future federal bureaucracy if Donald Trump is elected. So to a large extent, what we have been talking about for the last nearly 3 years is absolutely front and center in this November election. And for that reason, and not even that reason alone, I am so grateful that you have taught my audience and taught me. But you were gone over the weekend, and you said, "I'm traveling to Tennessee for Matt Hawn's hearing, which will be his first opportunity to legally challenge his termination after the 2021 school year." You might remember that Matt was the Tennessee teacher fired for assigning a Ta-Nehisi Coates article. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, he was terminated, Jonathan, in 2021. It is 2024. I would think that, you know, in order to achieve anything in the way of justice, you might have had a hearing within 6 months to a year. But I'm looking at them dragging their knuckles, and you're now at a hearing in 2024, and I am so shocked by this. But I also want to remind my audience that you sent me to his GoFundMe page, which should say everything, that in order for him to afford the legal services he's going to need to fight this termination, which he is legally allowed to do, but you can't do it without money because you have to hire lawyers to assist you. It wrote at the GoFundMe page, "Matt, known to many of you as Coach Hawn, was recently terminated," this is from 2021, "from his teaching position by the now former Sullivan County Schools Director, who has attacked Matt's introduction of racial justice materials to students to read and discuss in an upper level contemporary issues social studies class at Sullivan Central High School in Blounteville, Tennessee. Matt has taught as a tenured teacher in the Sullivan County system for 16 years, and prior to this past year, had never received anything other than satisfactory reviews as a teacher and coach, serving the entirety of his career at Sullivan Central High School, where look what he taught: economics, world history, cougar experience, personal finance, and for the past 11 years, contemporary issues." And I just want to also remind you that he was even recommended to our Teacher of the Year. So this is someone who every school would clamor to have in their school system. This is every kind of teacher you would want your young person to have. And yet, for whatever reason, and again, I want to remind everyone, we're talking Tennessee, which may explain the reason, he was terminated. So let me welcome you back to the program, Jonathan Feingold. And you just got back from this hearing and you said it was incredibly interesting. So what I want to know is, Remind my audience a little bit about the sort of the backstory for this coach. Isn't it interesting? We have another coach, Coach Hawn, and now we're talking about Coach Walls. There's something about these teachers that I have to admire. Maybe these coach teachers I have to really admire. But tell us a little bit about sort of the history of the location and the school system and this teacher, because you needed to know a little bit about this as we then approach the hearing that you attended.
Thanks, Arnie. As always, really nice to be here. One, I guess, clarification regarding what you said before with respect to the GoFundMe page and Matt's legal assistance. So my understanding is that the union, so he's part of the TEA, Tennessee Educators Association, and that the union is providing legal counsel.
Good, good.
Without a union, though, it is almost impossible to imagine that a K through 12 teacher would have the financial ability to legally challenge an improper termination. Whereas the school board has funding through taxes that we all pay to hire attorneys. And so if we're just thinking about the power dynamics, that make it much easier to fire, especially in a place like Tennessee, than it is to, defend one's ability to fight that termination or stay in the classroom. It's just important to recognize that that is real. I mean, that exists. But whether or not you have legal expenses, your life goes on when you lose your job, and in this case, like lose your profession. And so for teachers like Matt, there's very little safety net. And what I've heard broadly from teachers in states from Tennessee, Texas to Florida is that absent some sort of safety net, knowing that if you are improperly terminated because you stand up for LGBTQ students in your classroom, because you talk about Ruby, you share a book about Ruby Bridges, about integration, about desegregation, and you might be improperly terminated. If there's no safety net, then you will rationally not go near the edge of that cliff, because you know how easy it is, particularly for politically motivated boards or districts. Like just imagine Florida. You know that if you come anywhere near the line, there's a decent chance that someone's going to try to make an example out of you. And if you're on your own, if there's no community that's going to close ranks, then that just makes it such a precarious, scary, terrifying place to be.
I went and Googled his name, okay? And I went back to 2020-21 when he was fired. So I just want to read you two headlines, which really in some ways tell a bit of a story. A white teacher taught white students about white privilege. It cost him his job. That was the Washington Post. Now let me read to you from the Knoxville News. Teacher Matthew Hawn fired in critical race theory debate. He fights to get his job back. Notice which paper talked about critical race theory. The Tennessee paper. Okay? So every time you talk about race, depending on sort of the lens you're looking at, it's CRT, whether it is CRT or not, because they've turned that into this sort of boogie monster. And what I found fascinating was what the Washington Post said: a white teacher taught white students about white privilege, and it cost him his job. So those are just fascinating headlines.
Yeah, and descriptively, like the Washington Post is correct. So Matt Hawn racially would identify as white. Sullivan County, I think it's certainly over 90%, maybe 95% white. I think there was one student of color in his contemporary issues class. And sort of the first incident that, actually, let me just back up a little bit. So this all happened in the 2020-2021 school year, all the events that led to his termination. I think it's really hard. It's hard for me to just physically remember what it felt like that year. Mm-hmm. So that was going into the Biden-Trump election. That was coming off the summer of the George Floyd racial justice protest, the largest protest for racial justice in the United States, in the world, ever. And then the incredible backlash to that, that sort of began in the summer, fall, instigated by, right-wing activists like Chris Rufo, and then you had the election, then you have January 6th. So in the middle, when, and for teachers, this is when everything is on Zoom
Yes.
because it's still, it's COVID is still in a pretty scary place. We don't really know what is safe, what is not. Vaccines were, I do not think had really come out by the fall of 2020. Maybe the spring of 21 was when they arrived. I can't quite remember, but I think that's right. But so everyone is teaching over Zoom.
Mhm.
It is so hard to teach on Zoom. And think about teaching a contemporary issues class in this like 2020, 2021 academic year in one of the reddest districts in the country. I think Sullivan County went for Biden or Trump over Biden like 5-1. It is just,
Wow.
it's really, really red. And I'm really just meaning to be sort of descriptive. Um, and you have a candidate who is one of the most, in Trump, just sort of controversial, problematic, polarizing figures, maybe in the, certainly in the like recent history of the United States, maybe um, longer than that. And you have a contemporary issues class.
Yeah.
You are being professionally negligent if you are not trying to find ways to talk to your students about racism and race.
Right.
And so, and then there's January 6th, and you're a contemporary issues class,
I know.
and you're in Appalachia, Eastern Tennessee, a lot of sort of center left perspectives, perspectives from Black authors, not in the sort of mainstream discourse that you're going to get there. And so if you are a teacher and your goal is to expose your students to a range of perspectives, assigning
You
a,
know,
no,
you're
jump in.
being negligent. I mean, Jonathan, you're being negligent if you cherry pick what it is you do. And yet at the same time, part of the reason is I'm looking at Education Week. Educators' opposition to censorship comes at a big personal cost. And what they know with what they did with Coach Hawn is that they sent a message to every other teacher, not just in this community in Tennessee, but across the entire country. You better watch out because and what they're doing is they are now demanding that every teacher self-censor. That's what they're doing. They're saying if it even smells controversial, and define controversial through the lens of a conservative school board or, whatever the MAGA agenda is, because they've now decided what is controversial. All right. You may assume it's not. It's the facts. It's contemporary issues. It's whatever. But they have now decided you can't teach this, whether you're living in Florida, Texas, Iowa, or whatever. And that's why this story is so, it's not shocking, but it is so terrifying because you need a job. How do you find the next job? And you are walking on broken glass because you're never quite sure what it is you have to censor. So how vanilla is it that you have to offer your class something that really isn't contemporary issues? It's not even issues. It's contemporary safe. And that's not what they're to teach.
So one thing that was interesting about we don't have enough. I wish we had more time because there's a lot of just interesting dynamics in the hearing. But you also mentioned it's been 3 years since he was terminated. And so so I'm teaching education law this fall, and we will read a lot of cases that are, challenging sort of lawsuits that are alleging a violation of student civil rights, in which the plaintiffs ultimately prevail, but maybe not for 4 or 5 or 7 years. And so that's a generation of students who it's like going through your K through 12 system that don't get the benefit of that verdict or that ruling. And sometimes, the legal ruling doesn't actually lead to concrete substantive changes in the school. But so you think about Matt Hawn. So you might ask, well, why is this guy, um, who I think self-describes, at least in the hearing, it came up like, sort of left of center, what might motivate him to teach in Sullivan County? Because he went to school there. Because he's
Okay.
from there. Because his
Okay.
family's there. And there's actually a really interesting dynamic between sort of this area between the county schools and the city schools, where the city schools, because of how funding works, get more money than county schools. And there's essentially been like a slow attrition of students out of the county schools into the city schools, sort of leading to this recursive feedback loop, meaning that city school teachers get paid more.
Right.
So teachers like Matt Hahn are choosing to make less when they could make more because they care about the community,
Right.
because they care about the kids. And like you said, he was widely cherished. His principal called him a great teacher because he was a great teacher. And anyone who's ever been in a classroom engaging conversations about race knows that that is really, really hard, even when you're well trained and you have the full support of your administration. I think it's actually really, really hard to understand. I'm not even saying that I do, like what it is like to be in a place that is hostile to modest propositions like white privilege, which there was actually a couple experts who appeared. One was a scholar from UNC Greensboro who, in a like searingly sort of mundane way, explained that white privilege is a fact. Because if you look at, any number of metrics that sort of capture human well-being in the United States, you know that if holding all other factors constant, if you are white, you're more likely to be doing better on all of those. So then what are the theories as to why whiteness predicts better outcomes? Well, it could be that other groups are culturally inferior or biologically inferior. And this is what the expert is saying on the stand. He's like, but it turns out those are scientifically disproven.
Hmm.
And as he noted, they tend to rely on racist tropes, which is simply to say, which is a conversation that we've had, that racism has structural dimensions and leads to probabilistic outcomes that one can term white privilege, which is not to say that it's settled how, like, how pervasive, how powerful, how impactful race is, or one's ability to um, sort of gain the advantages of white identity, like what it is, but it's real.
Hmm.
It in the same way sexism's real, in the same way anti-Semitism's real, in the same way Islamophobia is real, in the same way racism's real. It is real. And there was just this there was this incredible made for TV moment at the hearing. And there was a local news station there that was recording. So I'm interested in seeing what gets sort of rebroadcast. They're recording sort of, they had a camera on the witnesses, but there was this line of questioning between Mr. Hahn's attorney and head of sort of curriculum, in part because in the fall, Matt Hahn, in a class that was recorded, did say that white privilege is a fact. Through his attorney's engagement with the curriculum uh, supervisor, I'm not sure, I forget the precise term, Matt's attorney was asking questions like, well, do you agree that there are times when being white as opposed to non-white can be advantageous, actually might lead to better outcomes? His response was, yeah, I agree. That can happen. Then there was sort of a circuitous sort of line of questioning because this is against the backdrop of sort of a narrative from the school board that teachers should not cut off conversation, that if you want critical thinkers, you have to entertain all opposing viewpoints. But so then Matt's attorney's like, well, what about a student who brings in an article from Alex Jones that is suggesting the Sandy Hook shooting never happened? It's a competing viewpoint. Would it be okay in that instance for a teacher to say, I'm not going to entertain this. Sandy Hook happened. Sandy Hook is a fact. Or what about someone who brings in an article denying that the Holocaust happened? Because we know, especially, in strains of MAGA world and elsewhere, there is sort of this narrative, this story, Holocaust, that didn't happen. So would it be inappropriate for a teacher to cut the student off and be like, I'm not going to entertain that because we know the Holocaust happened? It's not an open question. And so then there's this circuitous getting back to the question about white privilege, where the curriculum supervisor has already conceded that, yes, there are advantages that accrue to whiteness. Sometimes. And he is asked the question, well, do you believe white privilege is a fact? And this was one of the few moments in the hearing where it became what I think is accurate to describe as somewhat hostile and confrontational between the witness and the lawyer. School board's attorney tries to object. The judge, who I will say, I have no idea what will happen in the case. It's a Tennessee judge who is elected, who obviously is existing in a realm where there's a whole set of political forces, but from what I saw, was incredibly well prepared, seemed deeply interested in getting things right, did also seem to want to both be fair and be perceived as fair to both parties. So I don't know, whether facts will matter. But she overrules the objection. And so again, there's this question, do you believe white privilege exists? And this, I have to see if I can get the transcript, but the response was, it was so interestingly evasive in essentially trying to let there be a world in which, yes, it can happen, but no, it is not a fact.
Yeah, yes, but.
A yes, but. And yeah, it was just such an interesting, and there also you see just that the term white privilege, even if it is capturing a modest proposition, evokes a particular sort of emotional response and discomfort, because I think that it requires grappling with the fact that the status quo is not just and is not legitimate.
Actually, that is not, I have to end this with is not just, but I'm going to just sort of bring it a little bit home. And as you know, I had a young student from Ghana who was going to the law school living with me. And I live in white Concord, New Hampshire, but a very liberal community, very opening and accepting and that kind of thing. But you know what I needed to do, Jonathan? I needed to walk around the neighborhood and remind people that he lived with me and that he might be showing up at the house at midnight or 11 o'clock because he'd be studying late at the library. And it was okay. Don't call the cops. All right? Because why? He was a young man of color. And even though we think we're accepting and we're open and we're not racist and whatever, look what Arnie had to do in this very wonderful, wonderful, very liberal community. She had to do the talk and she had to do the walk. And that's here. Imagine Tennessee. And with that, this is Race Class. Once a month, every final Thursday of the month, we teach Race Class. And as Jonathan has said, Race Class, its purpose is that we know race matters. Part of this project is to make sense of what that means. Thank you, Professor Feingold, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Arnie.